All right. Good morning and good afternoon. The clock has struck 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here. So for the folks on the West Coast, good morning. And for the folks here on the East Coast, good afternoon. I hope you brought a sandwich. So thank you again for joining us. This is the 6th Annual Loan Review Survey Webinar hosted by DiCom. My name is Jim Alexander. I am the Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing for DiCom. Want to take a moment for everybody that has dialed in. Of course, thank you for taking time out of your day. I hope you find this review to be beneficial and enlightening. And for anybody that's on the line that took the time to actually complete the survey, thank you very, very much for doing so. Clearly, if you hadn't taken the time to complete the survey, I wouldn't have very much to talk about today. So very excited to get into this. We'll be going through somewhere between 45 minutes and a full hour describing the high-level results of the survey. Now, what should be noted is that we're not going to do any deep dive analysis here today. There's simply not time for that. But what we do is we'll be trying to present the results of the survey in a meaningful way so you can see trends in your industry. You can help or begin to benchmark yourself against other banks in your segment size. And hopefully this will be high-level beneficially to you today. And then what I'll do is follow up with the presentation right after this survey or later on today, so everybody will have a copy of this presentation that you can pass around your organization. And then eventually we'll be completing the white papers in the coming weeks, and I will be sending out a notification when those are available, so you'll have those at your disposal as well. So without further ado, I'll begin to speak about the survey itself. This year we had 129 respondents, which is about par for the course, right on average with what we had last year and previous years. So we had good responses. Our survey consists of 44 questions related to varying aspects of loan review, everything from portfolio sizes to types of loans in review to experience levels within various segments of the bank. Really, you'll get a flavor for that obviously as I go further in, but very, very broad-based survey that has remained consistent really over the 6 years we've been doing this, so we can do some trending and present these results year over year so you can see not only what type of responses we get this year, but how they compare to prior years. A little bit about the protocol. Again, I'll be doing a summary of the analysis. I won't be presenting every single question and graphs and slides related to every question. However, I will be presenting what I consider to be, and we here at DiCom consider to be some of the most meaningful results. I will have everybody muted. Unfortunately, you won't be able to ask questions during this presentation. However, you can use this chat dialog box up here. If you do have any questions, I will do my best to collect those and answer those after this webinar. So without further ado, let's get started. So a little bit about the demographics of the survey so you can get a perspective of what type of responses we got from various bank sizes and how that pertains to the survey respondent sample as well as the industry as a whole. So here we're looking at the survey participants only and the breakdown of what size banks they belong to based on their responses. And as you can see, we've got a pretty, shouldn't have gone forward there, a pretty good cross-section across various asset sizes. Here we've got really strong participation within the 1 to 5 billion segment, as well as the 5 to 10. Across the board, really up to 50. It's really at the less than 1 billion in total asset size that we really didn't get a great response rate. And you can see over here the percentage of our respondents where they break down. Again, of course, the largest percentage here being the $1 to $5 billion range. So when we compare that against the industry, we see that over here in the bottom right, we've got the FDIC latest information. I believe it's June 30th. I was able to take an export out of their database and identify the number of banks in the industry for each one of these given segments, and then cross-reference the respondents we had against the total market. So what you'll see in this graph here is really the percentage of the total market that we have covered in this survey. And the 10 to 20 billion range was, we had over 50% of the market responded to this survey. So great statistical data there. Pretty good statistical data across the board with the exception of the less than $1 billion range. So for the purposes of this, this webinar, I'm not going to really be presenting a lot of segment information for this segment. I'm going to be focusing on the 1 to 5 or the 1 billion and up. So again, very, very good data from the industry here with that one exception. So what we do early in the survey, we collect some data related to portfolio sizes, and this data is broken down into ranges. Essentially, the survey respondent will say our C&I portfolio size is approximately between this number and this number. And what we do is we take those numbers and basically averages. And when we do that, you know, we get what I would call a calculated portfolio size. So you can compare, based on our survey responses, where your bank falls within these ranges. And what I've done, anytime you're averaging averages, not the necessarily most well-recognized statistical methodology. However, what I did is I compared some of my averages of averages against actual FDIC data manually, just to see if these were correct and representative of the marketplace, and they were. So what we find here is when we look at the various portfolio sizes of C&I, CRE, and consumer, we see CRE makes up the largest percentage of portfolios in banks up to the asset size of $20 billion. Then when you get to these $20 to $50 billion range and up, C&I begins to take a larger percentage of their portfolio, and even in comparison, the consumer portfolios either are equivalent or outweigh the CRE. So you see a shift there based on asset size as to the makeup of the loan portfolios. So moving on, this is actually my personal favorite section, but who am I? A little bit of information about staffing, headcount, experience levels, salary, things like that. We obviously ask a number of questions in related to this particular area. And first and foremost, we take a delineation between management personnel in the bank by asset size, and whether or not, how many folks are actually associated with the management function, and whether or not they're performing management functions only, or if they're performing oversight and hands-on review work. And what we see here is essentially in the bank asset sizes from 1 to 50 billion, really the more propensity is that the management personnel assigned are performing hands-on work. Now, it's when you get to this $20 billion asset range that you really get consistently one full-time employee or greater that's associated to oversight only. Then when you shift over to really the above $50 billion range, you see a shift to management as a function being more really just management only and not performing as much hands-on work. And obviously, staff size, management staff size increases as asset size increases, which I think we would expect to see. So then we ask questions that allow us to delineate between junior and senior staff levels. And before I kind of go into the review of this data, just to identify the difference we make between junior and senior staff levels, a junior staff member is someone that would be, they would require some sort of oversight to complete a review. A senior staff member is somebody that could go through the entire review process without any help or additional oversight. So that's really the difference between the two. And what you can see, there's a couple of things that we find. but really one of the most telling things is that banks at all asset sizes have a higher proportion of senior staff to junior staff levels. And then clearly there's a nice linear trend here, staff size increases as bank asset size increases, where we've got, somewhere around, 2 to 3 employees on loan review staff in these $1 to $5 billion range. We're looking at 11 plus employees here at the $50 billion range. And again, nice linear trend as you go up from asset sizes. So comparing this data against 2016 versus 2017, just to see if there's really any trending on increase in staff across the various asset sizes, you can see that there's really not a identifiable trend here. When we're talking about junior staff levels, it seems to be fairly inconsistent whether or not these levels are increasing from 2016 to 2017 or decreasing for that matter. So here again, just in case you're trying to identify what this graph is all about, the blue here is the junior staff levels in 2016, and then the kind of not a mauve, but maybe a violet, that's the 2017 levels. So again, very inconsistent from 2016 to 2017. But when we go to the senior staff level, it was a consistent increase and a consistent double-digit increase, which I found was pretty notable. So there's two ways to look at this, but primarily, you could say, are banks reinvesting or investing more in senior staff levels, or are those junior staff members just increasing in responsibility and developing enough that they can transition to the next level? So you can kind of flip the coin and say it's probably one of those two factors, if not both. So then when we look at net staff change over prior year, took a junior and senior calculation here in 2016 versus 2017, basically added the two together to get a net staff differential. And here we see in all asset sizes, we've got an increase in net staff from 2016, with one exception. In the largest of banks, we have really a nominal decline. You could almost say that stayed flat. So generally speaking, it looks like there's been an investment in loan review staff from last year to this year. Moving on, we also asked some questions on years of experience of typical loan review staff members to allow us to, really present this information for you to benchmark with your organization. And here we've got some pretty decent linear trends here as we go from the various asset sizes from smallest to largest. Here in the blue, we've got the junior staff members. Here in the orange, we've got senior staff members, and in the gray, we've got management staff. And you see each one has a trend line indicating that, generally speaking, years of experience in all categories have a positive correlation with increase as asset size increases. So not the most perfect of linear trends. The best one is probably with the management staff. That's fairly consistent across the board. Senior staff, we have some anomalies and a little dip here and there, but again, generally positive trend. So I think that the main takeaway here is that, generally speaking, larger banks hire more experienced personnel at basically all levels. So then we also look at salary levels, and here we find that there's really nice linear trending. It's almost pretty. When you look at, again, the junior staff levels, the senior staff levels, and the management staff levels, there is a very significant trend as bank size increases, as does salary range, or as does average salary. So what we get here is really some, what I would say, fairly accurate national averages. And if we're looking at the junior staff, the average staff or average junior staffer should be looking at between $40,000 to $76,000 a year, and that's salary only from the smallest bank to the largest banks. Senior staff, we've got a range from $73,000 to $111,000, and then management staff, $105,000 to approximately $145,000. So these give you some pretty decent ranges to compare and contrast within your organization, and also some data as your bank may increase in size, you know, keeping in mind what that salary trajectory may have to look like if you're going to be competitive in your segment. So then I thought it would be interesting to just calculate salary as a function of years of experience. And this really helps us delineate, are the larger banks paying a premium for these employees, or are they just generally hiring more experienced people at a higher salary, so paying kind of a market rate for that additional experience. And what we find here is that, you know, fairly consistent salary per years of experience, so there's not really a premium that these larger banks are paying for the experience. And really we find the banks in the $10 to $20 billion range are the most likely to actually pay the most for years of experience. It's kind of the sweet spot from an employee standpoint. So again, that's another analysis, another way for you to benchmark and compare, but you know, it's really up to you to determine how you want to slice and dice this data and what comparisons you make and which ones are relevant to your organization. It's my job to hopefully present you with some ideas and some ways that you can look at the data. So then something that is near and dear to a lot of our hearts, bonus eligibility. And this question is essentially all about whether or not loan review staff are eligible for a bonus, and if they are, if that bonus is based on a program which is not described, they're not eligible for a bonus, or if they're eligible for a bank-wide pool bonus. So what we really find here is 83% of respondents are eligible for a bonus. So far and away, most commonly, loan review staff are eligible for the bonuses, for a bonus, and it's most commonly a bank-wide pool by an order of magnitude in comparison to the other options. So that information was fairly consistent across asset ranges, but we did find that banks above $50 billion in assets were more likely to utilize, quote-unquote, another program. And based on the comments of the survey, they were more likely to have a kind of hybrid approach where it was an individual objective-based bonus that also there was a component of a bank-wide pool. So we found that the largest banks were more likely to have kind of a hybrid approach to the bonus that they offer loan review staff. And then we have questions related to the amount of consumer loan portfolio reviewers, and essentially what you'll see here is based upon the asset size, which we kind of identified that the consumer loan portfolio sizes for these smaller banks were, I don't want to say insignificant, but in comparison to the larger banks, quite different. And we find that, you know, there's a staffing implication there, and it's not likely that these banks from $1 billion in total assets to $20 billion in total assets are going to be allocating a full-time resource to perform consumer loan review. And you know, we even see that you know, not very consistent trending here, but even a trend towards the decline here in the 10 to 20 asset range. It's when you get to these you know, larger asset sizes, the 10 to 50 billion, typically we'll have one full-time employee, and then when we get to the largest of banks, we're looking at 2 or more full-time employees allocated to these, you know, fairly sizable consumer loan portfolios. So then moving on, we look at the C&I and CRE exposure per staff reviewer. That's combined C&I/CRE exposure when we're taking into account this particular analysis. But what we find here is fairly stable exposure, especially in this $5 to $10 billion range. It's when we get to these larger asset sizes that we're starting to get to, an increase from 2014 to 2016, then kind of a plateau here at 2017. It seems like we've kind of normalized, even a slight decline here at the $20 to $50 billion range. It's when we get to this size, seems to be the portfolio sizes are increasing faster than the staff size. So there's kind of a disproportionate increase in portfolio size in comparison to the staff, and we actually kind of saw that when we looked at staff sizes increasing in these ranges, and this was the only range to really not indicate a net staff increase. So I hate to go too deep into the analysis, but that could be a root cause there as to why this one, this largest asset size, continues to have a higher exposure per staff reviewer. So then we look at loan review staff or support staff by asset size, and we find that most commonly here in the $1 to $20 billion range, most commonly the loan review staff does not have any staff support, whether or not that's from within the department, outside the department, or even a number greater than one within the department. Where we get to the larger asset sizes, we find that they're typically, at least more typically, inclined to allocate one support member from within the department here in the $20 to $50 billion asset range. It's when we get to this $50 billion asset range, they're most likely to utilize additional support outside the department, and that's, once you get to that size of a bank, you've got a much more complex hierarchy and department structure, and commonly, you have a support organization within that bank size. So then we dive into whether or not banks are requiring yearly training for loan review staff. And we've asked this question for a number of years, and going back to just 2015, you can tell that there's a shift in the industry. Clearly, that it's more and more common to require training of your loan review staff, and we're finding that here at DiCom with some of the events that we hold yearly, that's something that's very important as well. But what we see here, there's really two things to take away from this slide. First and foremost, that as bank size increases, as does the likelihood to require training for staff members. And you see the over $50 billion range, 100% of the respondents from the past 3 years have indicated that they do require training. And then the other thing is, in the other asset sizes, you see there's an increase, generally speaking, specifically speaking, from 2015 to 2017. You'll see there's an 8% increase, 11%, 36%, and 25%. So becoming the norm. Even if you're one of the smaller banks, still more likely to require training than not. And then we look at annual training budget for review staff, and we see very commonly that $500 to $1,000 is the most likely budget per review staff member, and that we're finding that 70% of banks report an annual staff training budget. So really, most commonly, again, the $500 to $1,000 range per head. However, split evenly is less than $500 and less than $1,000. So some section highlights just to make sure we didn't lose sight, or I don't lose sight of the key takeaways here. Management personnel are more likely to perform hands-on review work at all but the largest banks. So if you're one of the $10 to $20 billion asset range banks and you're a manager and you're having to do hands-on review work, you're in good company. Salary experience levels trend up as bank size increases. They were pretty profound and dependable trend lines there. And what was interesting, though, is that as the salary increases, it's not necessarily increasing at the same rate as the experience level. And then banks of all sizes are more likely to employ more senior staff than junior staff, and double-digit increases in senior staff across banks of all asset sizes. And then last but not least, significant trend upwards for requiring training of loan review staff members, and the average budget between $500 and $1,000 per person. So now we'll dive into some questions related to actual loan review process. And first and foremost, we start with banks that are outsourcing the function of loan review. And 25% of our sample, so 1 out of 4 respondents, indicated that they are outsourcing the loan review function. And what we find here is a couple things. First and foremost, we got data from 2013 all the way up to 2017 just to identify trends, if any. And the most significant trend is lack of skilled staff in place is no longer really a major factor in decision to outsource. It's been decreasing year over year. What we do find is that independence of role and cost savings have been on the decline, or been on the incline rather, increasing. With the exception here in cost savings 2013, this has been on the incline as well. So most significant reasons in 2017 we can say are independence of role and cost savings. And independence of role, clearly, we know that's one of the most important factors of loan review in general, so we would expect to see that. So then we ask each year primary objectives of loan review, of the loan review department, and we get very, very consistent results, generally speaking, year over year. What we're doing here is we're asking a ranking of 1 to 10, essentially, for these different objectives, and we've got risk rating accuracy all the way down to call code and compliance, and higher number is clearly better. Closest to 10 would be really the most significant. So what was interesting is the top 2 of these remain unchanged in the past 3 years. So consistently, risk rating accuracy and asset quality, number 1 and number 2, year over year. Underwriting increased from the top 5 into the top 3 this year, so an increase in importance or weight of that being an objective this year. And policy compliance was the 3rd in 2015 and 2016, so that dropped all the way down to 5. I don't know if that's a data anomaly or a trend, so we will see as we get into the 2018 survey if that holds true, if there's something driving that, or if we're just seeing a slight data anomaly there. All right. Moving on, we also identify where loan review is performed. The options are travel to site, combination primary office and off-site, and at primary office. And really nothing hugely profound here other than the main takeaway. If you're conducting your loan reviews at primary office, you're in the majority there. So you're in good company, and that was across all asset sizes. So really travel to site was insignificant. We had a very small percentage here at the $1 to $5 billion range. Elsewhere did not even make it on the radar. And then, of course, we had the largest banks most likely. Sorry, I jumped ahead just a little bit, but we had the largest of banks most likely to potentially do a combination of off-site and at primary office. So then we also identify the approaches used to set the review schedule, and we see some consistent themes here, and really risk-based and targeted portfolio segments being the most common across the board. Now they kind of, there's an anomaly here with calendar being the number 2 choice here in the $10 to $20 billion asset size, but you'll see, generally speaking, risk-based and targeted portfolio segments being the most common approaches. And here we've got the grand total, which then, basically combines all the data across all the segments, and we see that, again, very, very close. Risk-based approach is just above, and then targeted portfolio segments at 75%. So clearly in this question, multiple selections were allowed. That's why we don't have totals to 100% here. So should say approach is used to set loan review schedule, if I was being perfectly honest. And then something, as I've done demos in joining DiCom, this is something that seems to be a big topic and actually a big split in perspective as to what level of review should be performed, whether it's at the note level, the borrower level, and the relationship level. As you can see from the survey here, borrower and relationship are the most common, and I've heard sides argue for borrower, I've heard sides argue for relationship, and both sides make very good arguments, and it's very compelling discussion. So just for the purposes of the survey and for benchmarking, what we find here, which was interesting to me, is smaller banks are more generally likely to perform reviews at the relationship level. And based upon the survey results again here, larger banks are generally likely to focus at the borrower level. So again, it's a matter of perspective on which level a bank is going to perform most of their reviews at, but seeing both sides of the coin, and it'll be interesting to see if the market shifts one way definitively or another. Then we also identify what types of loans are in review, and we do this year over year, and I did a comparison analysis all the way back to 2013, and what we really find is these don't shift a whole lot over time, and at least that's been my analysis here. And you can see here, again, very consistently, commercial loans, most common types of loan in review, then commercial real estate, falling right behind, actually even this year, and then construction loans making up the third, and then we've got kind of the rest down here, so to speak. But there's really not a lot of major shifts here, but there's some slight shifts. We notice both commercial real estate and consumer real estate increased by 3% and 7% respectively. And then we had some that declined more than just a couple points, which ag loans were down 4% and dealer finance down 7%. So if there's any shifts that are noteworthy, those are probably the most noteworthy there. And then identifying sample selection criteria, you see that kind of a couple takeaways here. The primary ones are pretty consistent year over year, large borrower, problem watch list loans, and new loans being kind of the most significant this year, and fairly consistent year over year when we're trending from 2013 to 2017. And you may notice that sometimes I do a yearly trend, and sometimes I do kind of skip a year where we get a 4-year trend with 3 or 5-year trend with 3 data points, and sometimes I do that just because it creates a better trend. It takes a little bit of the noise out of the analysis, so that's the reason for that. But another thing that we'll see here is that each one of these factors or sample selection criteria has increased since 2013. The only exception that would be a steady trend line would be new loans decreased from 2016 or 2015 to 2017. Otherwise, we'd have a year-over-year increase in all of these. So keep this in mind when we go to another slide. I'm gonna bring this back up, but the bottom line is that it looks that banks are taking a more diversified approach with sample selection for loan reviews. So just keep in mind that diversified approach, because each one of these is increasing. Well, the high ones are still the high ones. We have an increased trend in at least utilizing different perspectives to select the samples. So moving on, risk assessment criteria. You see credit quality far and away is the #1 risk assessment criteria. That's been consistent year over year since 2013. Not much has changed. We do find concentrations have become much more significant, as have really all of these. It's been a steady year-over-year increase for each one of these criteria, with one kind of asterisk exception. Exception levels was not an option in 2013, so it was an option that was added subsequent to that, so we don't have a trend that will showcase that data for that year. So remember when I told you to remember that slide from 2 slides ago? This is where it comes into play. And this was a little puzzling to us here at DiCom at first, but we take a look at C&I portfolio coverage. And the questions are delineated between, you know, do you shoot for less than 30% portfolio coverage in loan review? Do you shoot for between 30 and 40, 40 and 50, and so on? And I compared this data from 2016 to 2017, and what I found was it just didn't line up. There was a shift from 2016 to 2017, which shows that, generally speaking, in 2016, more likely to be at a higher coverage. You guys were reviewing more loans or a higher coverage, so to speak, in 2016. The survey respondents indicated really not as much coverage, even fairly high percentages in under 30 and 30 to 40. When we look at the median too, in 2016 it was between 60 and 70. The median here in 2017 is 40 to 50. And I asked in the first 2 surveys, survey webinars, does anybody have any ideas as to why this is occurring? We're a little puzzled, and I had some people that responded, and really the general feel was that taking a more diversified and risk-based approach to sample selection, so you may not be hitting as much, you may not be covering as much, but you're covering more effectively, so to speak. So that was the general feeling that, yeah, as a bank, we may be requiring less coverage from our review staff. However, we're doing a better job of identifying risk through better sample selection. So that was the takeaway. Whether or not that's 100% the reason, I think it's at least a good objective opinion. So the same thing really follows true here with the CRE portfolio. We identify it's not quite as pronounced, but in 2016, general propensity was to be in the 50 to 70 range, and here in 2017, we're indicating somewhere between 40 to 60 range. Again, the median was lower in 2017 compared to 2016, and I think that's probably based upon the same perspective there, different, more risk-based and holistic scoping techniques to maybe identify risk better through the scoping process that doesn't necessitate quite as much coverage. So that's my 2 cents, and that was a pretty good opinion, I thought, from a few folks that participated in the previous webinars. Then we look at the same thing, consumer portfolio coverage, and as you can see consistently, regardless of asset size, the less than 10% coverage is the norm there across the board. So nothing profound there other than it's pretty unanimous that, if you're somewhere in the 7 to 8% coverage range on your consumer portfolio coverage, you're in really good company regardless of asset size. And then we identify what exceptions are tracked by loan review. And the options are documentation exceptions, unapproved exceptions, and approved exceptions here. And essentially what we should have gone forward. What we see here is consistently unapproved exceptions being the norm here, with one kind of anomaly here, which I'm surprised to see approved exceptions being higher than unapproved here in this segment. So I would expect that's a data anomaly, but again, maybe there's something behind this that's hard to identify. But you can see, generally speaking, what we would expect to see with over here in this pie chart, documentation exceptions being the second most prominent at 31% of the total responses, and unapproved exceptions being at 39%, so that's kind of the number one out of the total sample. And you might wonder, and I think you probably figured it out, that multiple selections are allowed, so these percentages don't total 100. And when we're looking at the pie chart, this is based on the total responses, so this is a percentage of 100. And then where are exceptions cited, and you can see unanimously across the board for regardless of asset size, we've got some changes as to whether or not borrower level or note level are more common, but across the board, the most common response is citing exceptions at both the borrower and the note level. And just in my anecdotal experience in working with our clients and prospective clients, that has been certainly the most common perspective I've witnessed as well. So then, I like this question. This is all about whether or not banks are utilizing a loan review system, whether it be a custom built in-house system, or whether it be a vendor-supplied system, or whether or not they're more inclined to be utilizing Excel, Word, manual type loan review processes with the absence of what I would consider a true system. So we start here on the left. We find that 55% of the market is utilizing manual Excel, Word type functions. Then we've got 29% of the market that's utilizing a vendor-supplied automation system. And then we've got 17% of the market that has decided to build something in-house. And what we see here too with the trend line, as the asset size increases, more likely to be either utilizing a vendor-supplied system or a custom in-house system, which we would expect. Smaller banks can tolerate a little bit more of a manual process. When you grow in size, things get more complex, your portfolios get more complex. Needing some sort of system to increase efficiency becomes more of a requirement. And another two takeaways, in the $20 to $50 billion range, most likely to buy a system, and then in the $50 billion, the biggest banks with clearly the most resources, most likely to build their own loan review system. So not anything we wouldn't expect to see, but it's always nice when the data lines up as you expect it. Means the survey is working. So some highlights from the section. Decision to outsource loan review has trended towards independence of role. That's the primary reason this year, and the trend has indicated that in the last 3 years. Smaller banks are more apt to perform loan review at the relationship level. I wouldn't have necessarily projected that, but we've got a lot of data that would suggest and prove me wrong. And then both C&I and CRE coverage seems to be declining. And again, the jury's still out on that, but I've gotten some feedback from our community, both prospects and clients, that tends to be maybe some more refined, more holistic, and more risk-based scoping processes that allow risk to be identified, by reviewing and sampling a smaller portfolio, smaller bit of the portfolio, rather. And then exceptions tend to be noted at both the borrower and the note level, and that was independent of bank size. So now we'll move into the credit risk management process. And we have questions about the other responsibilities of loan review, and we get some consistent responses pretty much year over year. I compared to 2016 and found that the number one item, acquisition due diligence, was common across the board with almost every year, and that tends to be anecdotally what I hear as well. So you'll see here acquisition due diligence is really the most common across the board, irrespective of asset size. And what we find is that the secondary most common is the preparing and managing of regulatory exams, which we would not be too surprised to see. And that is consistent across asset size. Of course, there's some diversity and some adjustments when you look at across the board the various asset sizes. But again, consistently number one and number two is prevalent across the asset side. Excuse me while I get a sip of my coffee. So then we identify whether or not banks are utilizing a two-dimensional risk rating or a one-dimensional risk rating. And you see, what you might expect to see is that there is a trend, that there's a correlation between size of bank and propensity to use two-dimensional risk rating. That's been pretty common year over year. And what we're finding, which is also interesting, is 7 to 12 banks from $20 to $50 billion range are either utilizing 2D, and if they're not, those other 5 are transitioning to two-dimensional risk rating. So really, this survey sample that we have here of $20 to $50 billion banks, within a few years, 100% of this survey sample will be on a two-dimensional risk rating scale. And then 79% of banks below $20 billion have no immediate plans to move to two-dimensional risk rating. So once you get below this range, you've got more commonly one-dimensional and fine with it. But then 97% of banks above $20 billion are either using a two-dimensional risk rating system or transitioning to it. So my projection is within the next couple of years, you'll see the survey that if you're above $20 billion, you know, we're in the 90th percentile range of utilizing two-dimensional risk ratings. So very profoundly, where one-dimensional risk ratings are common, the count tends to be 10 or less, and that's very common. We would expect to see in those smaller asset sizes where they indicated one-dimensional risk rating is most likely. Count of 10 or less is the lion's share. And then more than 25 risk ratings is most common, again, where two-dimensional risk rating is prevalent. You see that even in compared to 21 to 25, significantly more, especially in this 20 to 50 billion range, but also the same thing holds true here in the 50 billion or greater. So who has the final say in load grading? It's the loan review manager, period, the end. I'm just kidding, but the highest percentage there, 63% across the board. The loan review manager has that final say. You can see that there's some other options here, the chief credit officer, the loan review officer, but really, I mean, I want to say it's unanimous, but certainly if the loan review manager is not the person that has the final say in your bank, I'd love to hear why, and maybe there's a unique perspective, but the most common here, again, loan review manager. And nothing extremely exciting here other than you probably should be imaging your credit files. We've got a 4-year trend here from 2013 to 2017, and there's been an increase in that trend of imaging. You see here 60% to 94, 58 to 92, 63 to 100%. Really, there's been a considerable and steady increase over 4 years across all asset sizes. So if you're not on that bandwagon, you probably ought to be thinking about it. Same thing with collateral files, almost the same analysis here with an anomaly here. That's the only thing I can call it. Identified here that the banks over 50 billion actually reported less percentage that are actually imaging their collateral files, and I think that's probably a data anomaly, but we'll see next year if there's some other premise or something that's driving that root cause, but my guess is it's probably a data anomaly. Then the highlights here. Most common additional responsibility of loan review consistently is acquisition due diligence and management of regulatory examinations. And acquisition due diligence has been number one as far as I look back on the survey, unless I missed something. So that's kind of a steadfast truth. The use of two-dimensional risk ratings increases with the size of the bank. I think we would expect that. And the loan review manager generally has the final say on loan grades, and that's across banks of all asset sizes. Imaging of credit and collateral files is becoming standard. We can see the trend, and where we're at in 2017, it's the exception to not be imaging these files. And we are moving on, and we are running short on time, so I apologize if I begin to speak awfully fast, but I want to be mindful of your schedules, and I'm going to continue on. So we have some questions to identify reporting lines across the various survey respondents, and we really find that there's 3 reporting lines which actually say a fairly common response. And in order of most common to least common, out of these 3, Chief Risk Officer, Board of Directors Audit Committee, and Board of Directors Committee other than Audit are the most popular. Here we have 50% reporting they either have a direct or informal relationship. Here we got 53%, and then 48%. So again, people could select multiple reporting lines, which is why these numbers don't total 100. And then we get to the least likely or less common reporting lines, Chief Credit Officer and CEO. We've got 22% that have a reporting relationship and 19% that have a reporting relationship. And you'll find that a lot of these are related to smaller banks where they're a little more flat, and that's where it's more common to have either a direct or informal reporting relationship with the Chief Credit Officer or the CEO. Then we look at reporting to Board of Directors, and we find that across banks of all asset sizes, quarterly summary reports are the most common, 52% overall when you average all these out. Quarterly summary reports are the most common for reporting to the Audit Committee of the Board. Quarterly summary reports, again, are the most common to the Risk Oversight Committee of the Board. And then when we get to executive management, we've got a little bit of a delineation. Monthly detail reports are the most common across the smaller banks, and quarterly summary reports are most common across the larger banks, as we can see here. In the line of business management, monthly detail reports are the most common response, 33% of the total. You see only here at the $20 to $50 billion asset range that there's other is weighted just as heavy as the summary report. And then when are annual reviews required? And you see that there's really across all banks except for the largest, that dollar level commitment is the most likely indicator or delineation of whether or not an annual review is required across these various asset sizes. And then when you get to the largest banks, believe it or not, they're most likely to review every relationship annually, most likely with, I guess, dollar level being the second most likely. So who performs these reviews? Again, there's not a consistent theme or a really one answer that is common across all asset sizes, but there are some things to be gleaned here. Likelihood of credit administration decreases as bank size increases. Likelihood of portfolio managers to be that function performing the annual reviews increases, generally speaking, with the exception of the largest banks, as bank size increases. Likelihood of lenders is fairly consistent across asset sizes. So if you're a large bank, most likely the lender, or most likely portfolio manager. If you're the largest bank, then it's the lender. But you'll see there's some information to be gleaned here, mostly for benchmarking purposes. And then last but not least, we ask questions on the acceptable level of criticizing classified loans as part of the total portfolio. And as you can see here, 1 to 3% tends to be the general consensus for the most common. But here, kind of second most, 3 to 5. So if you're in the 1 to 5% range, you're in the multitude of banks, and if you're outside of that, I'm sure there's a justification, but if you're benchmarking, somewhere between 1 to 5% is the most common. Section highlights. Loan review most commonly reports into the Chief Risk Officer. Reports provided. Quarterly summary reports are most likely to be sent to the Board of Directors Auditing Committee and Risk Oversight Committee. Monthly detail reports are most likely to business management. 1 to 3% is the most common acceptable level of criticized loans, and the same thing holds true with classified loans. And wow, we have made it. I hope you found this to be beneficial, and I hope I didn't have to go too fast towards the end. What I will do is I will follow up with a copy of this presentation to everybody that was on the line today and everybody that registered for the event. So I will do that later today. I want to thank you for your time, and I'm excited to hear from you. If you have some suggestions on how we could make the analysis better, how the webinar could be improved, I'm all ears, and really enjoyed doing this. I hope you enjoyed listening as much as I enjoyed presenting it. So thank you so much. On behalf of DiCom, have a wonderful day.